So I want to begin this morning with some true confessions. How many of you have watched a Hallmark movie, Christmas movie this season? Get them high, hold them high. Don't be... Okay, that's... Josh, you've watched them. Oh, yes, you have. There it is. Okay, now, I'm sorry to press even further. Now, how many of you watched more than one Hallmark? How many of you have binged like an entire day watching these Hallmark Christmas movies? Wow. Maybe we should have a moment of prayer. You know what? They're pretty good. Like they kind of hook you, don't they? I have to admit, I've watched a couple. Of course, I live with two women. There's one going 24 hours, 7 days a week. There's one going somewhere in the house. It's incredible. Now, you know, there's several of these things. I've got a list here of the top 15, which means that, like, there's many, many more. You know, so you narrow down to 15, and I'm not going to read these to you, but, you know, it's interesting that there's some similar patterns, aren't there, to these Hallmark movies, wouldn't you say? You can almost interchange actors and actresses, and of course some of the actresses are the same in all of them, but you know, it's phenomenal. But like there's one called Let It Snow. Did you see Let It Snow? Certainly you saw Let It Snow. When a resort corporation acquires a quaint family-owned snow lodge from retiring owners, a determined executive must spend time at the inn before Christmas to hopefully impress her boss and father with a proposed renovation plan. While there, she finds herself initially at odds with the owner's son, who shares her disdain for the holiday season, but eventually develops romantic feelings for him. You see that one? I saw that one. Okay, I'm going to read you one more because, you know, it's kind of fun. All right, here's Every Christmas Has a Story. You see that one? You can't remember them by title, can you? Every Christmas Has a Story. A television personality accidentally lets it slip on air that she hates Christmas, and then must try to repair her image by spending the holidays at the most Christmas-crazed town in the country with her ex-boyfriend, of course, the show's producer. The special town begins to slowly change her outlook on Christmas and reevaluate her feelings. See that one? Yeah, I saw that one. I saw him. I'm not embarrassed to say. You know, so there are these reoccurring, you know, themes that happen in this deal. And in fact, there is a, games that you can play. My wife had all the women in our small group come over for a Hallmark Christmas party. I did not stay there that night. But they had this little bingo game. And do we have that for you? Yeah. You probably can't read that, and I forgot to bring it in here. But, you know, so you have little themes that you expect in all these Hallmark movies. And so you watch a movie, and if you're the first to kind of check off, you know, the romantic interest, you know, or whatever the particular recurring theme is, you win some points or whatever, how the game goes. And so that's what she did, and I saw the aftermath of that party when I came in that night. But so anyway, that's Hallmark Christmas. Now, whether you love them or hate them, one of the things that most of us would agree with is that the movies don't really get to Jesus, right? I mean, like there's a lot of neat Christmas themed kind of, you know, family and love, and there's certainly a lot of decorations, you know. There's a lot of Christmas kind of stuff there, but you really don't get to Jesus. Now, I can't say that I've watched every one, so I don't want to make a, you know, across the board statement. But in terms of, like, you know, the reason for the season, you don't quite get there in the Hallmark movie. Now, the insider that we're going to look at today, as we continue the series, you know, we're basically saying, come and see what are the insights from the insiders around the Christmas events. Well, the insider we're going to look at today, he definitely gets the reason for the season. Now, you may be surprised because the insider we're looking at today is none other than King Herod. Herod, you mean the one who, like, killed all the babies 2 years old or younger? King Herod, you're talking about King Herod gets the reason for the season? You better believe it. Because what insight that Herod gives is this, is that Christmas is much more than adoring a child. It's about allegiance to a king. Christmas is much more than adoring a child. It's about allegiance to a king. And King Herod, when he finds out that one's been born king of the Jews, like he takes that seriously. He doesn't dismiss it, which to kind of giving away some of the passage here, but like unlike the scribes and the Pharisees and the priests who are hearing the same information, in fact, they know that he's supposed to be born in Bethlehem, like they do nothing. At least Herod responds, though in a very negative, terrifying kind of way. But he takes it seriously. That Christmas morning, the birth of the Messiah, it's not just about adoring a king, it's about adoring a child, it's about allegiance to a king. And this morning, as we kind of look at the insight that we gained from King Herod, all of us too need to ask the question, like when I approach Jesus this Christmas season, am I primarily about adoring the child or about allegiance to the king? And do I typically separate those two things? Is it possible to really adore the child and not recognize his lordship? Not recognize that he is more than a redeemer, but he's the ruler? Is he the ruler in your life? The ruler in my life? Is there anything this Christmas season where you think that the Lord wants you to do? And you're saying, no way, Lord. Now, you might not articulate that. But in your heart of hearts, you're saying, Lord, I'm going to follow you here and here and here. But these areas, they're off limits. And I wonder if there isn't a little bit of Herod in every one of us. Well, let's take a look. Let's find out. Join me in Matthew chapter 2. Matthew chapter 2, we're going to take a look at this passage. We'll look at 18 verses. Now, what is said in contrast in this passage is the response of Herod in contrast to the response of the Magi, the three wise men. Though we're not really going to spend a lot of time on the wise men. We really want to kind of narrow in on Herod. What's up with Herod? He's the insider from whom we're looking for insight this morning. Let me read this passage, chapter 2, verse 1. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, where is he who has been born king of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose, and have come to worship him. And when Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. And they told him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet, and you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Then Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, go and search diligently for the child. And when you have found him, bring me word that I too may come and worship him. After listening to the king, they went on their way. Behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. And when they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. And then opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. Now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, rise, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt and remain there until I tell you. For Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him. And he rose and took the child and his mother by night, departed to Egypt and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son. And then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious. And he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all the region who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and loud lamentation. Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they are no more. Well, as we go back to the beginning of this passage, there's a couple of observations I want us to make. And first of all, I want you to see the expectations of the Magi. What were the expectations of the Magi? Like, they show up. They've been led by a star. There's a lot of ideas about how God did this, where there's some kind of natural way that God was using. I personally believe that it was just a supernatural phenomenon, kind of like the Shekinah glory, kind of like what led Israel through the wilderness. I think it was something more of that nature. Notice that it doesn't lead them to the house yet. It leads them to Jerusalem, and because wise men, like this is one born king, so maybe they're kind of checking in with the authorities in Jerusalem, but they come to Jerusalem, and the expectations are, notice, like, where is the one, they ask, where is he who has been born king of the Jews? Now, they don't ask, where is the one who will become king of the Jews? They say, where is the one born king of the Jews? Which would have been kind of an affront to Herod. Herod was not born a king, he was appointed a king. And so challenging that is one who is born a king. And notice that it's not someone who will be, but who is now. Which is why Herod finds it so troubling. But the expectation of the Magi were that this is one who's born a king and that he's already been born. Now, just a word about the Magi. We call them three wise men, probably from the east. I tend to agree with many others who think they were probably from Babylon. You remember that in the 5th, 6th century that the Jews were captured and deported to Babylon. Many of the Jews did not return when they came back into the land of Israel. Not all the Jews came back. Many stayed there. It was there that Daniel wrote his prophecies. Daniel wrote about the chronology of some of the times of the Messiah in Daniel chapter 9. And it's very possible that these wise men, who were kind of a collection of people ranging from sorcerers to astronomers to consultants to the king, interpreters of dreams. Like, this is kind of the group of people here who have come. It was their job to kind of know the ancient writings, and many of them would venture into things that were written with, what was to come in the future. So at any rate, I think influenced by the writing of Daniel, and I can't prove that, but that's my belief, that they have come believing that this is the time for the Messiah to come, and that God has led them supernaturally with this manifestation of this light or the star. And so they come, we see their expectations, and they raise the question about where. And so Herod, who's, put off by this, the idea that another king has been born, he wants to find out where. So what does he do? Well, we move to the expectations of Micah. Because the scribes, those who were responsible for making copies of the Old Testament, those who were also the teachers, the priests, those would have been like not only the high priest, but the chief priests, many of them Sadducees. The scribes were probably also Pharisees, like these religious leaders. They're kind of brought together, none of them who are overly friendly with Herod, nor sometimes overly friendly with each other. But Herod gathers them together to find out where is Messiah supposed to be born. And they correctly quote from the Old Testament book of Micah. Micah was written about 700 years before Christ. He was a contemporary of the prophet Isaiah during the reign of Hezekiah. And Micah gives a very specific location. In fact, we read here the quote, verse 5, and they told him in Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet, and you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. So you get kind of the rulership there. And from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. And so when you take these two things together, a couple of things emerge. First of all, that this child is going to be a ruler king. He's going to be a ruler king. Also, he's going to be a shepherd ruler. All of these are references to the coming of the Messiah. And, Herod responds, kind of reacts to that. And I think basically the first takeaway regarding Herod's insight would simply be this, is that Christmas is about the coming of a promised ruler. Christmas is about the coming of a promised ruler. All right, so, it's more than just a child that we adore. There's a king that deserves our allegiance. Now, Tim Keller, I think, summarizes it well when he says this. He says, if the Son of God was really born in a manger, then we have lost the right to be in charge of our lives. I'm not sure we always get that, but King Herod got it. King Herod understood. If this one born in Bethlehem is king, claims to be king, perceived as king, whatever, he understood that it was going to threaten his rule. And I think what you'll hear from me over and over this morning is simply this, is that we need to get it too. We need to understand, like Herod, that Jesus comes as our Redeemer. He's born, he's going to go to the cross and die for our sins, and all who believe that Jesus died for their sins, who say in simple faith, Jesus, I need your death to count for my sins. I'm hopeless in ever getting to heaven. I can never work my way there. My only hope is the death that you paid for me in your resurrection. I put my faith in you. I ask you to come into my life, be my Savior, be my Redeemer. I want the free gift of eternal life. And every one of us who responds in simple faith to what Jesus has done, we enter eternal life in a relationship with God we can never lose. We know Jesus as our Redeemer. But the Redeemer who comes into your life is a ruler. And he calls us to follow and obey him. Herod got that. We must get it as well. I love this quote. If the Son of God was really born in a manger, then we've lost the right to be in charge of our lives. Who's in charge of your life? That's too convicting. Let's move on. So Christmas is about the coming of a promised ruler. The second thing that we find in the passage moves forward where, basically Herod is going to, try to find out where this guy is. So verse 7 says, then Herod summoned the wise men, secretly ascertained from them. So he's obviously got a conspiracy going on. He's up to something. He supposedly, you can almost see him, maybe kind of touching his mustache like a villain. Like, I want to worship this man too. Please go find him and report back to me so that I too can worship him, he says at the end of verse 8. Now, here we learn that he's troubled, that Herod is troubled, and that he's threatened. Well, what is he threatened by? Well, one of the things that you would think right off the hand is, for power. I mean, he's the appointment there. He's kind of ruling over Judea under the ultimate authority of Rome. He has worked hard to finesse good relationships and rapport with the Jews. King Herod is the one who was famous for a lot of construction. In fact, the temple at the time of Jesus was constructed by Herod, started in like 20 BC. It was a restoration, a renovation, an expansion of the temple that was built after the exile under Haggai and Zechariah. And he took that second temple and he made it into the glorious structure at the time of Jesus. He built many other things, but he was a man who was paranoid about power and the threat. He was responsible for killing not only many of his enemies, but of his own family as well, securing power. And so he feels threatened by this. And we can maybe relate, maybe not to that extreme, but to our own desire to maintain power, maintain control in our lives. What's interesting as well, as I mentioned earlier, is that the fact that the scribes and the Pharisees, like those who have information, they don't bother going. In fact, one of the things going on in Matthew is establishing that Jesus is the king. Jesus is the promised king. And one of the things is that the Gentiles were going to respond to him more than the Jews. And we see this right away in the fact that the wise men represent the Gentiles. They're coming from the east, from Babylon. And so they're interested in going to worship Messiah. But the Jews and the scribes who have information are pretty indifferent. You could say are almost apathetic about it. And I think that we are wise to listen to that as well. Like we who have sat under Bible teaching and, listened to our favorite speakers on podcasts and have gone to Bible studies and read the books and have so much information. Is there a passionate worship that drives us? Or is there perhaps an apathy and indifference? In contrast to them, again, is Herod, though not for a good reason, but he's anything but apathetic. He knows that this is much more than just adoration of a child. This is about allegiance to a king. And so he's threatened, and also we know that he's going to threaten others. And so the threat by Herod is indicated when he talks about, this conspiracy. Hey, come report back so I can go. Obviously, he wants to not go to worship, but he wants to go to, to kill him, to take him out. That's clearly his idea, and it's stated explicitly even later in the passage. And so when I think about this, the insight I think we would take from here is simply this. A promised ruler challenges our personal reign. If Christmas is about the coming of a promised ruler, well, then a promised ruler challenges our personal reign. Now, all of us who are followers of Christ, and I understand you may be here today, you're just kind of checking things out. Maybe a friend invited you or your family member in town, and you wouldn't really describe yourself as a Christ follower. That's fine. We're so glad that you're here. But for those of you who would consider yourself a Christ follower, I want us to think about a moment how Jesus invites us not only to place our faith in him as our Redeemer, but to follow him as our ruler. Like, what are some passages maybe that come to mind where Jesus bears that out that we need to respond to? Well, surprise, I picked a few. I'll share with you. Here's a couple that come to mind instantly for me. Psalm 24:1. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and those who dwell therein. A person of faith understands that all there is belongs to God. That he's our creator and that he also purchased us on the cross, that we belong to him. Not just we, our own lives, but all that we have. Like everything in the world belongs to the Lord. And so when we're tempted to think that we have ownership over anything, this passage reminds us that we don't. That it's the Lord who owns all things and owns us, we ourselves. A second passage is Luke 9:23. Now here Jesus is talking directly to his followers. And he says, if anyone would come after me, he must do whatever he wants. If anyone comes after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross daily, and follow me. Now, can you imagine any potential, governing ruler, a pastor, a small group shepherd, our state governor saying, hey, listen, all of you, you're to follow me, you're to deny yourself, take up your cross. Like, we'd push back against that, wouldn't we? And is there something in us that would kind of push back here even against Jesus? Like, you're saying deny yourself? Jesus will go on to say that whoever tries to save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for me will save it. And what he's talking about there is not how to get to heaven. He's talking about, listen, you're going to decide whether you're going to call the shots yourself, trying to save your life, or you're going to lose your life and follow me, follow my rulership, and thereby you will save the best quality of life there is available. But this passage is Jesus calling us to follow his leadership, his lordship, his rulership. Let me show you one more. Romans 12:1. Romans 12:1, it says, therefore I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Now, the phrase that's most important in this verse is by the mercies of God, which is a summary of the first 11 chapters of Romans. In light of what God has done for us, saving us and securing us, forgiving our sin problem. In light of all of that, here's our response, is that we lay down our lives on an altar of worship as living sacrifice. Like, God, my whole life is yours. All that I have is yours. All of my resources are yours for your purpose. It is totally comprehensive and complete. That's what God asks of you and of me. You know, this Christmas is about more than adoring a child. It's about allegiance to a king. It's about allegiance to a king. Now, all of us probably have stories like this, because when we make these kind of decisions about, submitting to the lordship of Christ, you make decisions, but you have to renew those day after day, because none of us consistently live that out, do we? This side of heaven, we'll struggle to consistently live that out, but nevertheless, there is this idea of that, Lord, I want to follow you in every area of my life. And I might struggle and move up and down in that, but that's the direction I want to head. The other side that I'm talking about, which is kind of Herod, is saying, I will not have this man rule over me. I will not surrender this area of my life. You hear the defiance behind that? One, there is allegiance, but maybe inconsistent. The other is like no allegiance. My only allegiance is to myself. I think about times in my life. I remember when I was young in my Christian life, but I had someone helping me, and I learned that you shouldn't really get involved in a relationship, dating relationship or whatever, with someone who's not a Christian, who's not spiritually like-minded with you, who doesn't share your faith in Christ. And I remember I was involved in a dating relationship with a girl who did not share that same faith. And I remember taking her out to dinner one night and just saying, look, we can't continue seeing each other. And I remember just fumbling the reason why. And I think I made a total wreck out of it, but the issue was that my heart was, this is a hard decision I need to make because of what Jesus says. Because sometimes what Jesus calls us to do is not something you want to do. But because Jesus calls you to do it, and if he's your ruler, you do it. Fast forward a number of years, and really there's several stories I could tell here, but fast forward a couple of years, and I remember coming here and planting this church, and moving through over the years, and just kind of doing church, enjoying the role of managing the staff and developing leaders, working with the elders, preaching, and doing this. And then it was like there was an area of my Christian life that I was totally blind to almost. Not completely, but the area of actually trying to engage people far away from God with the gospel was not something that was really front burner with me. Lord, sometimes, people who don't know Christ, they're in church and, they hear the gospel from me. But me personally, being an introvert and kind of falling into this wrong thinking that, I don't really need to be involved in getting to know people. And then God said, Danny, remember what I said in John chapter 20, verse 21, where Jesus says, as the Father sent me, so send I you. Remember what Jesus said at the beginning of his ministry when he said, follow me and I'll make you fishers of men? Remember, Danny, what I said right before I left the earth when I said, go and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you, and lo, I will be with you even to the end of the age. And these passages just began to weigh on me to say, I have got to give energy and intention to getting to know people far away from God. And frankly, that doesn't happen during church hours. That happens just like for you. Like you do your job and you do whatever you do, and then you come home and you say, Lord, I want to reach out to my neighbors. Or maybe it is at work, I'm reaching out to colleagues. But for me, that was another lordship decision. What is it for you? Here's a cartoon of someone being baptized. See this? What is he holding above the water? It is, Lord, here's my life. Except for this. Don't touch this, Lord. What is it that maybe you're holding out of the water? Man, Herod knew the reason for the season. Herod knew it wasn't just about adoring a child. It was about allegiance to a king. And it threatened him, his power, control, comfort. And man, he was threatened by that. A promised ruler challenges our personal reign. We want reign over our lives. Well, the passage ends with just this horrific scene. We are not spending a lot of time on the wise men's visit to now the home where Jesus is living with Mary and Joseph. This is about a year, at least a year later after the birth of Jesus. And there's several different reasons from the text why we know that to be true. But at any rate, they come, the light leads them, and they come and they present these gifts to Mary and Joseph and Jesus, and all that happens, and then they're warned, as I read earlier, to go back another way. And then Joseph is then warned, and he leaves for Egypt. We pick up with at the end of verse 14, and it says, that he rose and took the child and his mother by night, departed to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. Which is interesting how this whole scene, ugly scene with Herod, is marked here by his imminent death. In fact, right after the passage, end of the passage, verse 19, it says, "But when Herod died," that he's the one that will be passing from the scene. Nevertheless, here's his response to what I would call Herod's terror. "And when they departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared and to Joseph in a dream and said, 'Rise, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt.'" I'm sorry, I'm reading the wrong place. Verse 16. "Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious, sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem." We don't really know. Bethlehem was not overly populated. It's about 5-6 miles out of Jerusalem. Some have estimated probably a number between 12 and 30 children. Of course, even one is an abomination. And so they are sent probably immediately as soon as Herod realizes that the Magi, the caravan, have left by another route, that he's been had. And so he just goes and wipes out all just takes his best guess. He was probably born within this period of time. And so he has these young boys killed. And then we're given kind of this picture of Rachel's tears, a quote from Jeremiah 31. It's kind of an application of a historical passage. This is probably here Jeremiah is looking at the death of many of the Jews and the deportation to Babylon, what we call the captivity. And he's talking about those who of the descendants of Rachel, which would be of Israel. And he's looking at some who've died and some who are going off for the 70-year captivity. And he applies those words to these young boys, the slaying, the killing of the innocents, as many have described it. And, when I think about that, I think a legitimate application to draw here, another insight from Herod, is simply this, is that rejecting the promised ruler creates a private reign of terror. That when you reject the promised ruler, you create a private reign of terror. Like for Herod, if we had the time to look at his descendants, like who figure into the, especially the book of Acts a number of different times, like it doesn't go well for his descendants. And when you think about what many often talk about, how dad is destiny, We see that Herod certainly unleashes a private reign of terror that extended beyond him. Obviously, his reign of terror, because he rejected allegiance to the king, certainly impacted the lives of those young boys killed and their mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles and grandparents. Is it possible that if we reject the rulership of Jesus in our lives, that decision, renewed over and over and over again, can have really negative consequence in the lives of those who follow in our wake? Because the decisions that a dad makes does not determine the response of a son or daughter, but it does influence it. It does influence it. Doesn't determine it. And I just think that there is this sober point in this passage where the private reign of terror that he unleashed, that we can do the same thing. Tim Keller in his book Hidden Christmas says this: according to the Bible, the evil of the world ultimately stems from the self-centeredness, self-righteousness, and self-absorption of every human heart. Each of us wants the world to orbit around us and our needs and desires. We do not want to serve God or our neighbor. We want them to serve us. In every heart, then, there is a little Herod that wants to rule and that is threatened by anything that may compromise its omnipotence and sovereignty. Each of us wants to be the captain of our own soul, the master of our own fate. Christmas is more about adoring the king, the child. It's about allegiance to the king. I want you to do me a favor, if you would. Would you indulge me with this? Would you just kind of get quiet before the Lord for a moment? Close your eyes if that helps you. I just want to give you some time to think about your own heart right now. If I asked you, do you adore the child? I'm sure you'd all say yes. If I asked you, how's your allegiance to the king? You probably have to think about that. So just in the quietness of your own heart, I want to just ask you, like, what are the things that you tend to hold out of the water? Maybe it's your thought life. Just fantasies that you entertain in your head that you know that's not good. Maybe it's priorities. Have to do with time. You've just insisted on certain things that really fall outside of what God said would be your priorities. Maybe it is relationships. Maybe you're involved in a relationship you shouldn't be involved in. And you've refused to deal with that, to surrender that to the Lordship of Christ. And this Christmas could be the day you say, Lord, I'm surrendering. I'm giving it to you. Similarly, it could be the area of sexuality. Have you surrendered that completely to the Lord? Follow Him. Could be finances, like learning how to steward your finances from a biblical standpoint, biblical stewardship. Moving away from just buying whatever you want, whenever you want. Going further into debt. Just refusing to allow God to have rule over that area of your life. Maybe this morning you could change that. Maybe it's in the area of ministry where God's saying, I want you to be involved in serving me. You've said no. He wants you to pursue friendships with people far away from God? You've said no. He wants you to multiply disciples and disciple other people, and you've said no. You deal with the Lord on those things. And let me remind you that Jesus Christ came to Bethlehem for the Herods in the world. And no matter what rebellion is currently at play in your life, we've all rebelled against God, believing the lie that He's holding out on us. And yet He's not. He gave His own Son to die for us. And He died to forgive us of our high treason and our rebellion. And even the times when we shut off areas of our life from Him, He stands ready to forgive and to continue walking with us. So today, this time, you make that right with the Lord.